So, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Brophy. For those of you who are looking at your programs, to continue Steve's analogy on baseball, I'm pinch hitting in for Ryan Gallagher today in GE. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Life Sciences in GE Healthcare. GE Healthcare, I think, is an established partner in the biopharmaceutical production area. We've got a global presence. I think we're a strong collaborator with many of the, or if not all of the big pharma and biopharma. And we consider that the whole area of cell and gene therapy is an addressable adjacency. So we're very keen to be part of a meeting like this and to work as a collaborative partner with companies who are moving into this space. Given this the last presentation today, let's reflect on what Maury said at the start of the day, just to put this into perspective, because what we are focusing on here is the investment background. So Maury talked about $2 billion worth of investment in the cell and gene therapy space this morning, down from a stellar 2015 as year to date. $2 billion perhaps of other types of cell investment, and again, we had some of those positions reflected here today. In the UK, Keith's slide showed some $400 million investment in the UK, perhaps up tenfold over a course of about 3 or 4 years. So it's clear that we are in a situation where things are bubbling along nicely. And I also reflect on the fact this afternoon that the talk turned very naturally to manufacturing and some of the potential problems as this industry scales into real time. And I thought that was perhaps instructive and reflective as well. So what we want to do today is acknowledge that nothing happens in a vacuum and absolutely nothing happens without funding. So we've got a number of investors reflected in this panel. I'm going to ask Marcus to speak a little bit about risk. I'm going to ask Genghis to speak a little bit about scaling and market and some of the activities he's been involved in. And we also have Ed Hodgkin in the audience from Syncona. Syncona is the investment arm of Wellcome, and I know Ed has got some thoughts on exit strategy. I'm going to keep this pretty interactive. It's only half an hour, so I'm going to invite comments from the floor as well. I deliberately give you line of sight to the areas that we want to cover. So please, if you want to be involved, just raise your arm and we'll make sure we get a microphone to you. But I'll start with Marcus. Marcus from Rothschild. Marcus, I think you deal in quite a unique situation with high net worth individuals. How do you and how do your clients assess risk as they consider activities and opportunities such as this?
Thanks. So I think first thing to say, obviously I'm not a scientist, and despite some sort of very small PA investments, not an investor either. But the joy of my role investing sort of mostly clients' nest egg portfolios is and working for a bank like Rothschild, one of the advantages we have is that we don't have product to sell, and therefore we can give very objective and independent advice. And in doing that on the nest egg side, very often we get asked to look at more interesting areas in the client's portfolio, potentially some of the growth areas such as this. And we have seen increasingly more interest from some clients, and talking to Genghis before, about where do those clients come from that are looking to invest in the space. And I think it's clear that some are coming from the space within, so people who have, the scientists who've come out of it and exited successfully, but also people who've been affected by it. In terms of our corporate advisory business, we obviously advise businesses on strategic M&A, debt, equity, and have a very strong healthcare team within that. But it always strikes me, sort of talking to people within this space, of which I'm really personally interested in, and coming to a few of these things like today is just the opportunity for investors out there, and going back to Dr. Nathwani's sort of 4 words this morning: single dose, permanent cure. And that's sort of, for an investor, I think it blows me away. But if that wasn't sort of enough, you then, Edward, his comments of sort of saying, we're now seeing a stunning efficacy never seen before in medicine. So that's really for me the excitement, certainly for my clients, that's the excitement that they see. And I think there are a few areas in investing today where 10x, 100x returns are possible. But obviously, there is a huge risk to doing that. When calling some of my clients to sort of ask them in preparation for today, and sort of said, what do you think about when you're thinking about the risk in this area? After the sort of the laughter had died down, we then sort of got a little bit more serious, and certainly seems that when thinking about the risk, for some it just doesn't matter. When they're investing in and that may sound bizarre, but I'll clarify it. In investing in the really early stages of this science, the trigger for that investment can often be philanthropic. So, a loved one, a friend has been affected by one of these diseases, and therefore that these people have significant means that they are able and willing to get involved and get their hands dirty in the science. Now, when I think about risk in investing for their portfolios, and you've got to again remember, I'm thinking about wealth preservation in real terms, not 10x, 100x type returns. So when I think about risk, I sort of categorise it into two broad categories. I look at shallow risk and deep risk. Shallow risk is the sort of the day-to-day volatility. For us, looking at companies like Adaptimmune, that's the day-to-day upping and downing of the share price. For you involved in businesses, that will be the inevitable delays that you will have and experience along the various pipelines. And that sort of stuff is you've got to accept it and you've got to be prepared for it. It's the deep risk, it's the permanent loss of capital that when I'm investing for clients, that's the stuff that we're looking to avoid, which obviously in this space is more difficult, especially when investing at the earlier stages of the science, which certainly an increasing amount of high net worths are getting involved in. And when they think about that risk, sort of looking to divide it up into the stages, you sort of got that technical and regulatory risk at those earlier stages. You've got the manufacturing risk, of which we heard a huge amount of today. And certainly I don't think that's an area that I have seen many investors investing in, although certainly listening to Rosalind, that's a great sort of area of diversification. So maybe that's a bit more interesting if that can be accessed. And then you've got the sort of the scale up and the commercial, the reimbursement risk at the top end of the scale, and that's something that certainly I don't think many of my clients are even thinking about it at this stage because they're sort of focused on at the earlier stage. But I think that the way I sort of see the risks at the earlier stages is we're at quite a sort of changing point, and a lot of the critical, a lot of safety barriers and the efficacy we've got to a certain stage now where that has advanced much more than it was, and I think we are at the beginning of a revolution that will last potentially several decades in seeing that science develop from. In immunotherapy, a group of immunotherapies looking at a small number of cancers to a much broader scale. So I think that will inevitably reduce the risk, and we always encourage clients to try to avoid binary risk where you can be exposed to that permanent loss of capital and potentially get some more portfolio effect, which I think is becoming increasingly possible. The only other thing that I'd just like to add sort of at that stage is when we're looking at investing, and it's sort of been mentioned in a couple of the panels today. When we're looking at businesses to invest in, for our clients and the portfolios that we're in, we're looking at the sort of the Unilevers and the Nestlé, so very different businesses. But I think a lot of the fundamentals of investing are ultimately the same. You want to have a business that has pricing control, high barriers to entry, all of which advanced therapies does. But I think then the more interesting space, the more interesting things at this stage is making sure that you've got that management team in place that has the business plan. We mentioned in the manufacturing that doesn't just take you to the end of your phase 3 and potentially the beginnings of getting it out to market. It's looking at how you take that forward. And then the other most important thing for us when looking at a management team is seeing how they allocate capital. So making sure that when you're raising sort of the 25 million euros, these huge numbers, for our clients, making sure that capital is allocated really, really efficiently. So that's broadly. I know I'm sort of representing a tiny portion of investors into this space at a very low end, and I know that a lot of my investors access the space via the VCs and the EIS schemes, of which is great because any of those tax rebates, and I think in the UK, which I'm obviously based and see clients investing in, those tax favourable, the patent box, the R&D credits, the EIS scheme, it just helps to de-risk a lot of the fundamentally risky stuff down at that end of the scale.
Good. Thank you, Marcus. I liked your analogy of the shallow, or not analogy, but a juxtaposition of the shallow and the deep risk. I have to imagine in this space still the potential for significant gains and significant risk still probably obtains. But Genghis, I'd like to turn to you. I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit on some of your involvement with the space, how you see the space maturing, and maybe just to follow on a little bit from what Marcus said, do you see an advantage or a need for a variety of different funding sources as we go through the stage of the industry as it is at the moment?
Well, maybe we take the last first, because you're representing sort of high net worth primarily. We're more traditional venture capital. We were fortunate enough to do well out of the first wave of gene therapy. We were investors in Genetic Therapy Inc., which got bought by Sandoz. It was a great return for us. Unfortunately, nothing came out of that, but it was a pioneering days, and we know it takes a long time to bring these technologies to fruition. It's taken 20 years, really. But then we invested in GenSight, and you heard Bernard Gilly earlier on a panel. And that helped reduce one of the big risks we worry about is toxicity. Now, GenSight is ophthalmic gene therapy, so you immediately remove the risk of systemic toxicity. And the second thing it did is you don't have to worry about pre-existing immunity with your vector, because the eye is an immunoprivileged site. And then most recently, as recently just a few weeks ago, we invested in a UK spin-out from King's College called Gamma Delta Therapeutics. Now, the gamma delta T cells are a specific subpopulation, and we're looking at a subpopulation of the population called tissue-resident gamma delta T cells. And these seem to have amazing properties at killing tumour cells. It's like their function is to patrol the tissues and spot areas of cellular stress, like oncogenic transformation, and then go and kill those cells. And one of the things that gamma delta therapeutics can do, which nobody else has been able to do previously, is grow up these tissue-resident gamma delta T cells without causing T cell exhaustion. Now, this is early stages yet. We're a long way from having a marketable product, but it's very exciting, and our first investment in cell therapy. And we're still looking for other investments in cell and gene therapy, in vivo, ex vivo, and so forth. So we think there is a lot of opportunity there. At the end of the day, you can't get rid of the binary risk, and that's why you have a portfolio. But nothing succeeds like clinical success. Clinical data trumps everything. So we've seen, for example, in the eye, a number of academic groups show that they could treat a particularly rare condition called Leber's congenital amaurosis. But that showed that you can actually get this single dose cure, which we think is a permanent cure. Certainly the follow-up data at 4 and 5 years looks good. And so that clinical data gives us the confidence to go there and say we'll sort out the manufacturing problems over time. But we wouldn't underestimate them. And in fact, you heard what Bernard Gilly was talking about, the manufacturing issues. My own belief, and I'm biased and I'm on the board of GenSight, but my own belief is that the clinical risk is comparatively low there, because we've seen very impressive phase 2 data. But the biggest risk for almost any in vivo gene therapy at the moment is manufacturing, because certainly in the US there hasn't been an approved therapy. Mm-hmm. And in Europe we've had Glybera, but that apparently only sold 1 dose. Mm-hmm. How long is it going to take to get in vivo gene therapies or ex vivo gene therapies, cell therapies, approved in the US? Which obviously is yeah.
So, and I'll switch to Ed after this. So, Laura, maybe if you could Ed the microphone. But again, you mentioned the Sandoz. So in your example, I imagine you guys created and captured the enterprise value through the commercialization of Sandoz. Unfortunately, the operational value probably didn't accrue.
Yeah.
And how do you think of that, even as you think of some of the other examples you engage with?
Well, we continue to be very interested in gene therapy, and we looked at many opportunities. And then it was a coming together of various things, like the data I was mentioning, and the fact we knew Bernard Gilly, and we'd backed him before in a previous company. So for a long time, we were saying we're not going to invest in a cell therapy company because there's too many issues. But things have changed. And so, we've taken the plunge just recently, but I think we'd like to take some more plunges.
Very good, very good. Mm. So Ed, I know that you think about exit strategies, and this is largely untrodden territory. So again, if you're in Organon some years ago and you're developing Keytruda, you go and talk to your friends in Merck, and that deal is done, and that's a very, very nice exit strategy. If you're working in Medirex on Opdivo or Yervoy, you go talk to your friends in BMS, and again, the value returns to the early investors. But the nature of some of these products, the distributed local nature of these, may not make that exit strategy as applicable. I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
Thanks, Joe. I mean, so actually, we really don't think about exit strategy. And in fact, our strategy is to build real businesses that will take products to market. And if you look at the history of really successful biotech companies, as are built in the US, for example, and that we really have too few of here, they're companies that have managed to finance their pipeline all the way to commercialization. And so our ambition is to build companies that will do exactly that. We've built 8 companies so far. Our intention is to be long-term investors in those companies. And even if they were to go public as a financing event, if we still believe in the future of those companies, we'll hold our shareholding in those. So we really want to back them for the long term. I think, as you alluded to, in the cell therapy world, autologous cell therapies in particular, which are not pills in bottles, there is no natural buyer for these companies. Because, as you say, traditionally in a partnership or an acquisition by a big pharma company, you're adding your product to their pipeline. They already have a sales force that sells to doctors in that therapeutic area. They have manufacturing. They can manufacture the drug that you've discovered. There is no piece of the puzzle that's missing from what a company like Autolus or Adaptimmune is doing that the big pharma has, and therefore is a natural partner. And I think that's the reason why the big pharma companies, with possible exceptions, maybe Novartis, have not jumped into this field, because they're really waiting for one of these companies or several of these companies to build a fully integrated company that solves the problems of logistics and supply chain and so on, before they can bolt that on as a new kind of business. Because if they were to buy Juno or Kite or Autolus today, they wouldn't be able to complete the business, because they don't have those pieces. And so they're going to sit on the sidelines and wait. And so for that reason, we need to be able to finance these companies all the way to success. And that's going to need sort of like-minded, long-term, deep-pocketed investors. And of course, in the UK or in Europe, we have some of those, but probably not enough. And it's going to mean access to public markets, preferably in London or in Europe. And that means a sort of full spectrum of investors through to knowledgeable, specialist public market investors, which we don't have in the UK anymore. So there are some sort of structural faults, I think, things are getting better, don't get me wrong, because we have an increasing number of sort of long-term investors. I think quite a few companies have managed to go public in the last few years, sort of in this space, some of them in London. And so things are improving. But I think we're a long way from that sort of complete ecosystem of small and large companies, some with real products on the market, and investors that are willing to come in at scale all the way along that continuum. So.
It strikes me again the need for a variety of investors in this space. Perhaps even it's a nature of the Wellcome Fund. The fact that the Wellcome Fund has a duty almost to contribute to care. So I think you guys look at investments perhaps in a slightly different way. But perhaps the philanthropic nature of high net worth individuals, the VCs who perhaps see the opportunities, but also, we talked a little bit about this at the ministerial panel yesterday, the need for an environment in which reimbursement happens in a meaningful way and quickly. The nature of, for example, autologous T cells will mean that people will set up manufacturing and clinical trials where they can expect reimbursement. And I think this has to be a consideration as we think about how these therapies are funded. Sorry, Genghis, go ahead.
No. Well, I was just going to add a point about the big pharma companies standing back, and and some of them. It's sad to say at a conference like this where we're talking about cell and gene therapy, but some of them, Roche might be an example where they say we are not interested in cell therapies. We'd rather find bispecifics or anything that can do what you can do without having a cell. So there are some extreme naysayers there that we've got to work on over time. But I do believe the clinical data will trump everything else.
Clinical data is interesting. This morning, I think somebody made the observation, and I'm going to perhaps articulate more flippantly. It's a good thing that Carl June's first 3 patients survived, and I think a lot of the public sentiment was based upon that. So in this space, convincing clinical data can be on a very small number of patients and survivors. And the nature of their survival obviously recruits a lot of empathy and sympathy and a desire to invest in this space, but the numbers aren't huge.
Well, and conversely, it was a single death like Jesse Gelsinger in the early 90s in gene therapy set the whole field back at least a decade. Yeah.
Let me throw it open to the audience. It is another side of the coin we've been discussing today, the clinical space, the therapy space, the manufacturing space, the need for investment across the piece. As I look around the audience, is there anybody who'd like to make a comment or question in the space? Please.
So, I'm really going to ask Genghis this. As a VC, of course, you do need a return on your investment, so you do need to look at the exits. So, can you comment on, from your perspective today, what you think preferred exits are in Europe and when they are different from investments in the States?
So, the long and short of it is that the primary exit is a trade sale. And an IPO is typically a financing on a way to a trade sale. Occasionally, an IPO is, we never sell in an IPO. Sometimes the stock does very well post-IPO and you can sell post-IPO. So it's sell in the market if the stock is doing very well and it's liquid and you're not going to damage the company, or it's sell in a trade sale. But and that's why it would be nice if there's a wider universe of pharma companies that was open-minded about cell therapy. But I think they're all sitting on the sidelines. And as I say, there are some that are extremely sceptical, some that are much more open-minded, like Novartis.
Good. Please, Keith. I'm not sure you're going to get it.
Okay. So it's a very simple question. It's one of the great characteristics of these products, or at least some of these products, is because of the very high and strong clinical signals, the velocity of development is faster. So, a lot of the financing structures that have kind of grown up around biotech and small molecules expect a kind of slow velocity through the system. So you think this faster velocity will change the nature of who's in and who's out at which point?
And Ed, I'll come back. I'll let Genghis start, but maybe Ed, I'll come back to you on this as well.
Well, you're certainly seeing bigger financings, much bigger syndicates, but getting the money up front and trying to make sure you don't have to rely on the IPO market. So we had this fantastic market in 2014, 2015. It's much harder now. Our deals in the US are getting done. We had CRISPR Therapeutics go out last week, but these deals have intense insider support. Often more than 50% of the IPO is being bought by insiders. And so I don't know how sustainable that is for how many companies. It's only going to be a smaller number. But then the follow-on markets, people can do very large offerings still. And it really has to come from the public markets because it's not coming from collaborations to the same extent. There are some big headline numbers that get people excited, but the upfront payments from the big pharma companies, with a few outliers, have actually not been that impressive. So there's still a heavy reliance on public markets, and prior to that, having strong syndicates that can put big numbers together. The VC world, fortunately, the venture capitalists have raised a lot of money in new funds, and so are well prepared to keep funding these companies.
Ed, your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think Keith's right. It's the pathways to approval are much shorter with these products potentially because you go into end-stage populations. You have to do a comparator, and the size of the efficacy response means you can, and the sickness of the patients means you can put up with more side effects actually, and so maybe the safety database doesn't have to be as large as it would be for a chronic dose drug, for example. And of course that makes a big difference, and you can finance the company, I guess, with less money to the point of sustainability. But let's not kid ourselves; it's still a huge sum of money needed to get to that point. So, but it does make a difference, yeah.
Very good. So I see it's 5 o'clock. I want to be fair to the audience, to everybody else. So I'll hand back in a moment. I'll make a reflection though as I've listened to the conference today. I've heard the term heroic medicine being used in this context. We're dealing with stage 4 patients. We're dealing with patients at death's door. When those clinical results come in, we empathise with the kids or whomever who've been treated and cured in some cases. But I definitely felt a maturation of the space in today's conference. I'll be interested in any comments afterwards. We started talking about things like clinical trials. We started talking about things like dates. We're aware of dates for Novartis, for Juno, for Kite. We started bemoaning the fact that the lack perhaps of GMP accredited manufacturing facilities. As somebody said, these are good problems to be engaged with, because I think they do speak to the ongoing maturation and the opportunity space in this. So I think it's an interesting time once a year to look back and reflect upon this market and see how we're doing. But with that, I'd like to thank my panel members and Ed for contributing very effectively to the session. Thank you.